Welcome back to our second video going through the story of Mark. We've put out the big divisions through Mark, and we're just going to look at each section in turn and try and get an idea of the big way Mark is making his points in each one of those. So if we start with Mark 1 to 4, first of all, it opens with lots of exciting proofs about who Jesus is. Isaiah says he's great, Mark says he's great, God says he's God. We've got huge expectations for Jesus. And then as he arrives, he can do anything, heal anyone, teach with authority, cast out any demon. He's amazing. But as we go through 1 to 4, we know from 1, 14 and 15, we're looking for people to repent and believe, not just be amazed at him or surprised. We begin to be a bit worried. People aren't responding the way we want them to. In fact, by 3 verse 6, the two most significant groups, the Pharisees and the Herodians, that's the religious leaders and the secular leaders of the Jewish state, they want to kill him. So suddenly we're worried. Maybe Jesus has made mistakes, maybe he's not doing it right, or maybe he isn't who we thought he was. And that's why the big block of teaching in chapter 4 comes there. Do you remember I said they don't come very often? When they do, they're there for a reason. Chapter 4 is explaining why people respond the way they do. Jesus isn't surprised at all. He doesn't think he's making any mistakes. Jesus doesn't expect many people to respond well. In fact, in the parable, it's only 1 soil in 4 who respond well. That's 1 to 4. Then in 5 to 8, the focus shifts to being much more about the disciples. Lots of focus on them, particularly in the 3 boats. So 3 times we have little boat journeys with the disciples and Jesus. And as I said before, each time it goes really badly for the disciples. And one thing I noticed, I used to use Mark's Gospel a lot with non-Christians teaching Christianity Explored. And as you go through those 3 boat accounts, people's sympathy for the disciples tends to evaporate and disappear. So the first one is in chapter 4, the end of chapter 4, and there's a storm, and Jesus calms the storm, and the disciples are really afraid and don't know who he is. And Jesus says, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And at that point, most people would say, that's very harsh of Jesus. Sure, this is a big deal. Their friend is God. How are they supposed to get that? It's expecting a lot for them to understand. And at that point, and I'd just sort of smile and nod and we'd keep going, we come across to chapter 6 from verse 45, and basically the same thing happens again. They start in the boat without Jesus. There's a storm again. Jesus walks across the water to them, says, "Don't be afraid." And again, they are utterly astounded. And this time it even says their hearts were hardened in 6:52. And at that point, in a group, you'd be about 50-50. There'd be some people still in the disciples' corner saying, "But it's a lot to understand. I understand why they're finding it so hard." And there'd be others saying, "No, come on. He's done a lot of miracles by now. They should at least react better than they did the last time." And then the last boat is in 8 verses 14 to 21. There's no storm this time, but Jesus is giving them a warning about becoming like the Pharisees, and they completely misunderstand. And the thing they're worried about is that they don't have enough bread, which is crazy, given that they've just seen Jesus twice produce enough bread to sink their boat if he wants to. And at that point, the whole group would be saying, the disciples are so stupid. Jesus says, "Do you not yet understand?" And the group would be saying, "Why don't you believe in Jesus yet?" At which point, with a group of non-Christians, it was always great just to be able to go, "Well, how about you? You've seen the same evidence that we looked through Mark. What do you think?" So the focus is on the belief of the disciples. There's some, chapter 5, chapter 6 talks about faith and what it is as well. That's the big focus. And what Mark seems to do is compare the disciples' response to some other people's response. At the beginning of the gospel, we're introduced to the disciples, and I think we quickly put them in the place of the good guys and as us. We identify with them, we think they're going to do the right thing, we're going to learn what the right thing is by copying them. But then 2 things happen that worry us, I think. So if we put the disciples here in the middle of our diagram, we meet a group I'm going to call the Tisk, who are the Pharisees and the leaders of Jerusalem, who really don't like Jesus. They're always telling him off, criticizing. You'll see why I call it that in a second, criticizing him. And whereas we'd have thought the leaders of Israel might like him, very quickly they're a long way from the disciples. They hate him. They want to kill him. So we see the disciples aren't like they're the good guys, those are the bad guys. And we'd think that might be the story. Goodies and baddies, cops and robbers. But then we also get introduced to a group I'm going to call the the miscellaneous characters. Again, lots of people have noticed that in Mark, we meet these kind of isolated characters who appear to be not just interesting, not just good disciples, but far more than that. They appear to be right over here at the other end of the scale. They're amazing. Jairus, who allows Jesus, trusts Jesus even after his daughter has died. The Syrophoenician woman who gets called a dog and says humbly, if there's any crumbs on offer for dogs, I'll have them. And you think, actually, they're not just like the disciples, they're much better than them. So we get a kind of spectrum set up with misc, disc, and tisk. So it helps me remember it. They all stand the same. But then towards the end of Mark 5 to 8, what happens is the disciples start moving. I think what we're hoping is they'll become more like the misc, as they'll get what Jesus is on about, they'll understand who he is, they'll be humble and trust him. But what actually happens is they sort of float around and begin moving towards the Pharisees, the tisk. So they don't believe who Jesus is in the boats, they do badly. We're told they have a hard heart, which is exactly what we were told about the Pharisees in chapter 3. And then in chapter 8, Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Herodians, as in be careful, don't become like them, don't be infected with them. And we're very worried. We think that's what they're becoming, and we can't see any hope for them. So we watch the disciples' reaction on the spectrum Mark set up. And I think that's one of the ways Mark teaches us how to respond. We really want to be like the misc. We hate to be like the Pharisees. We're worried because we thought we were the disciples and we see them going wrong. We're worried we might do that as well. And so we end chapter 8 really quite depressed because nobody seems to understand who Jesus is. The disciples can't get it. They can't see. And it's around that time, you might have noticed, Mark drops in some slightly unusual miracles. Unusual because there's a lot more detail. Jesus does some spitting, things like that. There's one in chapter 7, one in chapter 8. One is of a deaf man who is cured, and one is of a blind man that's cured. And in Mark 8, in the boat, Jesus says, are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but you can't see? Do you have ears but you can't hear? So what we're really looking for, if only someone could do this, is someone to open their eyes, open their ears, unharden their hearts so they could believe. And Mark puts that in the middle of these two miracles, because we do know someone who's good at those things. Jesus is good at those things. So that when in 8:29, Peter says he's the Christ, we've no doubt why he knows that. It's because Jesus has opened his spiritual eyes.